There were shocked reactions today from the baseball world to the shooting death of California Angels outfielder Lyman Bostock last night.
In the more than 150-year history of Major League Baseball, only one player has ever been murdered during a season. That player is Lyman Wesley Bostock Jr. And odds are, you haven't heard of him.
He was an artist, a guy that could hit the ball to all fields, a guy that could run, a good athlete. The way his career started off, we could be talking about a Hall of Fame player, a 3,000 hit guy, and just one of the greatest players ever to play the game. But unfortunately, it was cut short after 4 seasons.
It's shocking even to hear that news story once again. That's from way back 1978. Lyman Bostock, 27 years of age, shot dead back then. Tom Rinaldi doing the podcast, a multi-part podcast on that story, and he joins us now. Tom, it's Brian Kenny. Great to have you on the show and speak with you.
Thanks for having me, Brian. Appreciate it.
Tom, let's start with what drove you to this story? Again, it is largely forgotten. I remember as a kid, Lyman Bostock was a big-time player. What drove you to this story?
We had the opportunity, Brian, to first explore this story back at ESPN 14 years ago as a television feature. And while we had significant time to tell it then, there was so much beyond it about Lyman as a person. Wesley is the title of the podcast because that's what his family largely referred to him as, by his middle name. So much more about his journey to the majors, the son of a Negro Leagues player, what happened to him in college when he was swept up in a student protest and charged with felonies and went to jail. So many things that transpired in his pro career. What a great hitter he was to all fields. And then, of course, the tragedy that happened when he was murdered in Gary, Indiana on a Saturday night, the miscarriage of justice that happened as a result that followed. So much more to the story that we weren't able to fully explore. That's what led us back to wanting to tell it more fully in an episodic podcast form. First time ever for Fox Sports.
All right, Tom, then take us back then. 70s, he's with the Twins, goes to the Angels. Give us anything on what type of player he was. I mean, people can look it up on Baseball Reference. This guy was a tremendous hitter. What type of player was he? What type of person was he?
He really was, Brian, but it's one thing for us to say a career .311 hitter, the same batting average as Jackie Robinson, but to hear voices like George Brett, to hear Rod Carew, a teammate, talk about just what a quality hitter he was. The comparison that other players brought forth was perhaps Ichiro, a player who was contact more than power, who could hit to all fields, had great speed, was an excellent fielder, really just entering his prime, Brian, when tragically he was murdered on a Saturday night.
Well, let's get into that then. He's back right in Gary, Indiana. He's in a car with several people, ends up getting shot, right? Give us any details you can on that.
So Lyman was born in the South, but spent a part of his childhood in Gary, Indiana, where he had extended family before his mother moved him with $7 in her pocket, by the way, all the way to Southern California for a chance at a better, greater life. So every time after he reached the majors that he played at Comiskey, family from Gary would come and pack the stands, and he would often go back with them after a game to have a family dinner. That's what he did September 23rd, 1978, with his uncle, Tom Turner. At that dinner, Brian, a woman comes up, a girl in Lyman's memory who he used to read to when he was a child in Gary. And his uncle Tom says, she just lives a few blocks away. Why don't we go over and visit her? He does for a very short time, just a handful of minutes. He then offers to give her and her sister a ride across town on the way back to Chicago, to go back to the hotel for the night, not knowing that the estranged husband of one of those women, a man named Leonard Smith, would be enraged and jealous at the sight of her with another man, pull up alongside, never having met Lyman, knowing nothing about him, firing one shot into the back seat of a car and killing Bostock tragically.
So what happened in the justice system then?
Incredibly, Brian, what happened was not one but two trials. The jury deadlocked in the first trial and ultimately came to a decision and an adjudication in the second. There was no dispute about who had fired the shot. He was clearly identified by his then wife, he was estranged from. Leonard Smith was the killer. He didn't deny that. But Nick Theros, an excellent attorney, the Johnny Cochran of Northeast Indiana, if you will, at that time, offered a different tack. He offered that he was insane, Leonard Smith, driven there by jealousy and couldn't understand the consequence of his actions. And remarkably, the jury accepted that defense. So as a result, he was sent to Logansport State Mental Hospital. Brian, we cover all of this in the podcast. And after 180 days, was judged to no longer be insane. He was not then sent to prison. He was released, free, back into society at large. And where does he go? Back to Gary, Indiana. Where does he live? On the same street, 6 blocks down from the intersection where he killed Lyman. And that's where we encountered him 30 years ago. The only time I was ever able to be in front of Leonard Smith, the man who killed Lyman.
That's all right. So that's all in the podcast. I get we only have so much time here, Tom. Where do you come from this? When you're done with this, did anything happen as a result in the justice system or anything? Do we have a better understanding of anything, or just injustice?
Two things here, Brian, quickly, and I appreciate you having me on. Two things. One is so people understand much more about Lyman, how remarkable his life was, the quality of man he was, beyond just the fact of how he died. And number two, in death, that decision led to immediate change in Indiana, in its state laws and state laws around that region, where not guilty by reason of insanity would no longer allow someone to go free if they were judged sane. They would then go back into custody to serve the sentence in prison, not remanded back onto the streets.
Tom, where can people find the podcast?
Everywhere, Brian. Just this week, the final 2 episodes came out, all 8 episodes. We were fortunate enough to be #1 in sports across all categories on Apple. You can find it on Spotify, anywhere you listen to podcasts. Wesley, Fox Sports, its first foray into this sort of episodic podcast storytelling.
That sounds fascinating. And Tom, you always do a great job. Got our years together, and hope to see you again. Tom, great having you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian.